History often turns on moments no bigger than a heartbeat. Days when empires that seem invincible suddenly stumble, and the world's path bends forever. The story you're about to hear is one of those moments. A clash born from fear, ambition, faith, and sheer defiance. A single confrontation in the Middle East where a rising storm finally met a wall strong enough to stop it. This is not just a tale of armies. It is the tale of a civilization fighting for its last breath, and of a victory that rewrote the destiny of continents. It was September 3rd, 1260, a date that should be etched into the memory of the world. In a single afternoon, the balance of power in the medieval age shifted forever. On the soil of the Holy Land, an empire that had crushed everything in its path finally found an opponent it could not break. Strangely, most people today have no idea that this battle, fought on the land of modern-day Israel, determined how far the Mongol Empire would ever reach. Only a few years earlier, the Mongols had rolled across Asia like an apocalyptic wind. Kingdoms collapsed at their approach, cities smoldered behind them, and almost no army dared to resist. Yet in a quiet valley once ruled by ancient Jerusalem, the unexpected unfolded. How did the Mamluks, former slaves turned warriors, outwit history's most terrifying military machine? Why did one battlefield in Israel shape the fate of the Middle East, Europe, and even Central Asia? And what chain of events turned this single confrontation into the wall that halted a global empire? By the mid-13th century, the world felt as though it was burning at both ends. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan and held together by his iron code, the Yasa, had become a nearly unstoppable engine of conquest. When his grandson Möngke Khan rose to power in 1251, the empire stretched from the Pacific coast all the way to the plains of Eastern Europe. It was the largest continuous empire ever known, roughly 9 million square miles, nearly 4 times the size of today's Europe. But Möngke wanted more. The conquests of his ancestors were impressive, but not enough. His gaze turned to the last independent powers of the known world, especially the Islamic heartlands. To achieve this ambition, he entrusted his brother Hulagu Khan with a monumental charge: secure the empire's western frontier, crush any remaining Muslim resistance, and extend Mongol rule all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Historians later called this mission the Western Campaign, and it soon brought the Mongols face-to-face with the core of Islamic civilization. When Hulagu marched into Mesopotamia in the 1250s, nothing seemed capable of stopping him. Chroniclers estimated he commanded about 120,000 troops, a colossal force for the era, supported by Chinese engineers, Persian bureaucrats, and Christian contingents from Armenia and Georgia. His primary goal was Baghdad, the beating heart of the Islamic world and the intellectual crown of the Abbasid Caliphate for more than 500 years. In early 1258, the Mongols laid siege to Baghdad. For 2 relentless weeks, their siege engines smashed the city walls with stone and fire. Eyewitness accounts describe an almost apocalyptic scene: the Tigris River turning black with ink as the Mongols hurled manuscript from Baghdad's legendary libraries into the water. The exact death toll is still debated. Some Muslim historians claimed 800,000, others 200,000, but all agree it was one of the most devastating massacres of the medieval age. The last Abbasid caliph, Al-Mustasim, was captured and executed, rolled into a carpet and trampled under hooves so that no Mongol blade would shed noble blood. The psychological shock reverberated across the Islamic world. Baghdad's fall wasn't just a military loss. It was the collapse of a civilization. A city once alive with philosophy, astronomy, poetry, and science had become a silent ruin. The message was unmistakable: surrender and die anyway, or resist and perhaps survive. This is why Cairo, capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, suddenly became far more than just a regional power. It became the last stronghold of Islam. The Mamluks were extraordinary. None of them were born into royalty. Most began life as enslaved boys, Turkic children taken from the Kipchak steppes north of the Black Sea, sold into military servitude, and trained from childhood to become elite cavalry. Over time, these warriors grew so formidable, so loyal to one another, that they overthrew their masters and built their own state. By the 1250s, Egypt was governed by a ruling class of battle-hardened soldier kings, a meritocracy forged in war rather than inherited through birth, and that made them unlike any opponent the Mongols had faced. The Mongols thrived by exploiting chaos, weak dynasties, corrupt nobles, political disunity. But the Mamluks were the opposite, disciplined, organized, and trained to react as a single body to any threat. They were, in every sense, professionals who had survived slavery, betrayal, and relentless conflict. So when Hulagu sent envoys to Cairo in 1260 demanding surrender, he expected the usual response: fear, hesitation, collapse. Instead, Sultan Qutuz delivered a reply that stunned even the Mongols. He ordered the envoys executed, and their heads displayed over Cairo's famous Bab Zawela Gate. Imagine that sight, the severed heads of Mongol messengers dangling above a city that refused to kneel. It was more than defiance. It was psychological warfare. Qutuz knew exactly what he was doing. By killing the envoys, he erased any possibility of internal argument. No Mamluk commander could now lobby for compromise. The bridge to negotiation had been burned. Cairo would either fight or perish, nothing in between. And at that moment, something extraordinary occurred. The Mamluks united. They saw Baghdad's destruction not as a distant tragedy, but as a warning carved into history. If Cairo fell, the Islamic world would have no center left to defend. Here is where history bends in an almost unbelievable way, a twist that makes you question how much of the past is shaped by strategy and how much by fate. The Mongol advance, which had thundered across continents for decades, did not halt because they were defeated in battle. It halted because of a funeral. When Möngke Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol world, died in 1259 during his campaign in southern China, the entire empire seemed to freeze in place. According to Mongol custom, the moment a great Khan died, everything stopped. A Kurultai, a vast council of princes, generals, and nobles, had to be assembled to choose the next ruler, and every major member of the royal family was expected to appear in person. It didn't matter whether you were fighting in the forests of Poland, the deserts of Persia, or the mountains of China. If you failed to attend the Kurultai, your political legitimacy was shattered. This tradition revealed one of the Mongol Empire's hidden weaknesses. For all their brilliance in warfare and discipline on the battlefield, the Mongols still relied on a system built on family loyalty rather than institutions. Their unity rested on a single pillar, the great Khan himself. Without him, the empire had no permanent machinery to keep campaigns running. And so, when the ruler died, conquest had to pause until another leader was chosen. It had happened before. In 1241, when Ogidi Khan, Genghis Khan's son and successor, died, the Mongol invasion of Europe was abruptly abandoned. The Mongols had already destroyed the armies of Hungary and Poland and were poised to march on Vienna. But the instant news reached the commanders Batu, Subutai, and the leading princes folded their tents, gathered their troops, and headed home. Europe survived not through valor, but because Mongol tradition demanded it. Nearly 2 decades later, history repeated itself. When Möngke died, his brother Hulagu, then deep in the Western campaign against the Islamic world, was forced to withdraw the bulk of his forces and return east. Many historians estimate he took as much as 80–90% of his army with him, leaving perhaps 10,000 elite troops behind in Syria and the Levant. This remaining force, commanded by his trusted general Kitbuqa, was smaller but still seasoned and deadly, battle-tested cavalry and engineers, backed by Christian contingents from Armenia and Georgia. Yet numbers alone don't tell the whole story. Those 10,000 Mongols were sitting at the extreme western end of an overstretched empire. Their supply lines ran across thousands of miles of steppe, desert, and mountain. Even for a people famed for endurance, mobility, and self-sufficiency, the strain was enormous. Every arrow, every spare horse, every sack of grain had to travel farther than the empire had ever attempted before. Kitbuqa's men were confident, but they were isolated, stranded at the frayed edge of a vast logistical rope. And the Mamluks understood this perfectly. In Cairo, Sultan Qutuz realized that this fleeting moment, when a Mongol army in the west was both reduced and cut off, was the one chance his forces would ever have. For once, the numbers leaned in the Mamluks' favor, 15 to 20,000 of their soldiers against 10,000 Mongols. It was still dangerous, still uncertain, but no longer hopeless. Timing was everything. If Qutuz hesitated, Hulagu could return with the full weight of the Mongol host, and Egypt would be doomed. If Kitbuqa crushed the Mamluks before reinforcement arrived, the Mongols would solidify their hold on Syria and march south at will. So Qutuz moved quickly, gathering his commanders, rallying his troops, and marching north from Cairo toward Palestine. This is where history becomes a blend of fate and human decision. Möngke's death created the opening. Without it, Hulagu's mighty armies might have swept from Aleppo to Cairo without pause. But the death alone did not stop them. It merely cracked the door open. It was Qutuz and his brilliant Lieutenant Baybars who had the skill and courage to seize the moment. Even if Möngke had survived, Hulagu's campaign was beginning to strain under its own weight. His armies operated far from the grasslands that sustained them, in lands ravaged by heat, scarce in pasture, and hostile to Mongol logistics. Maintaining tens of thousands of horses and men demanded colossal resources: fodder, water, replacement mounts, skilled craftsmen, and constant resupply. By the time Kitbuqa was left in Syria, the western wing of the Mongol war machine was already stretched thin. And soon after, political fractures only tore the empire further apart. What had once been a united dominion controlled from Karakorum splintered into four competing realms: the Golden Horde in the north, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. The heirs of Genghis Khan, once bound together by loyalty and blood, now eyed one another as rivals and enemies. Against this backdrop of fracture and uncertainty, the Battle of Ain Jalut emerged as much more than a conflict between two medieval armies. It was a turning point. What unfolded on that September morning in 1260 in the Jezreel Valley became the Mongols' first true, decisive, and irreversible defeat, ending nearly 50 years in which they had appeared unstoppable. The Mamluk army itself was unlike anything else in the medieval world. It was shaped by a unique military ethos called Furisia, a rigorous blend of physical training, discipline, tactical skill, and moral code. Mamluk soldiers, many of whom had been brought to Egypt as Kipchak or Turkic slaves from the Eurasian steppe, were molded from childhood into elite cavalrymen. They learned to fire arrows accurately at full gallop, to wheel their horses in tight formations, to launch sudden countercharges, and to fight with lances, sabers, and bows with equal mastery. Each Mamluk warrior was effectively a hybrid, part Mongol-style horse archer, part armored knight. They could harass an enemy with skirmishing tactics, then pivot into a devastating close-quarters assault. This made them one of the few forces capable not only of matching Mongol mobility, but challenging them in shock combat as well. There was also a deeper cultural understanding at play. Because many Mamluks were themselves born on the steppe, they instinctively grasped the psychology and habits of steppe warfare. They understood the Mongols' signature moves, feigned retreats, sweeping encirclements, overwhelming arrow storms meant to break morale before the cavalry charge. These tactics were not mysterious to them. They were familiar. So when the Mamluks prepared for battle, they chose their ground with precision. Ain Jalut, modern Ain Harod in today's Israel, was not a random patch of land. It sat beside a natural spring, surrounded by the gently rising slopes and confined corridors of the Jezreel Valley. And for the Mamluk commanders, it was the ideal kill zone. The narrow valley would force the Mongols into tighter formations. Their greatest strength, rapid, sweeping cavalry maneuvers, would be limited. Their room to maneuver would shrink. Their tactical options would be constrained. Ain Jalut was a trap crafted with both terrain and psychology in mind. And soon, the trap would be sprung. The date was September 3rd, 1260, corresponding to the 25th of Ramadan, 658 H. And the timing was not a coincidence. The Mongols had been campaigning non-stop through the summer, pushing deeper and deeper into lands they had not yet fully secured. Their horses, the very engine of their military power, were exhausted from months of hard marching. The Mamluks, on the other hand, chose to fight on familiar ground, close to their own supply lines and abundant water. By forcing the confrontation near a natural spring, they quietly robbed the Mongols of rest and replenishment, an invisible but decisive advantage. At the center of the Mamluk force stood two remarkable leaders, Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant field commander Baybars. Qutuz, the ruler of Egypt, possessed both political cunning and a terrifying degree of personal boldness. When Kitbuqa, Hulagu's general, sent envoys demanding surrender, Qutuz answered in a way no ruler had dared before. He executed the messengers and displayed their severed heads above Cairo's Bab Zawela gate, where every soldier, merchant, and traveler would see them. It was brutal, but it was intentional. By doing this, Qutuz removed any possibility of negotiation and extinguished any internal debate among his emirs. There would be no faction arguing for peace, no hesitation, no fear. The Mongols' greatest weapon, terror, had been turned back on them. For decades, they had won battles before they even began, relying on sheer reputation to make entire cities surrender. But Qutuz's defiance shattered the illusion. The message was unmistakable. If the Mongols fought with fear, Egypt would answer with courage. When the battle began, the Mamluks charged aggressively. As the Mongols loosed their first volleys of arrows at Ain Jalut, they expected the usual chaos, panic, a broken line, a retreat. Instead, they saw a wall of Mamluk warriors holding firm. Their lamellar armor, layers of metal and hardened leather, absorbed much of the impact. Their own mounted archers returned fire in disciplined, synchronized volleys. The Mongols suddenly realized this would not be one of their usual victories. They were facing an opponent that understood their tactics and could match their speed. At first, the battlefield unfolded like a familiar Mongol script. The Mamluks began retreating in what looked like panic. To Kitbuqa, it must have felt like déjà vu, the pattern he had seen dozens of times. The enemy breaks, the pursuit begins, and the slaughter follows. But the Mamluk withdrawal was a trap. Concealed in the narrow valley ahead were reserve units lying in wait. The terrain, sloping, restricted, and difficult for wide cavalry maneuvers, became a weapon. As the Mongols charged deeper into the valley, Baybars sprang the ambush. Mamluk forces swung in from both flanks, slamming the trap shut. Suddenly, the Mongols were fighting in tight confines where their horses could not wheel or scatter. Arrows rained from every direction. And for the first time in decades, the Mongols found themselves forced onto the defensive. Even so, the fight remained close. The Mongols counterattacked with the discipline that had carried them across continents. At one point, the Mamluk lines began to buckle. And then came the moment that turned the tide. From a distance, Sultan Qutuz saw his soldiers faltering. Instead of shouting orders from safety, he threw himself into the fray. Chronicles say he pulled off his helmet, cried out, "O Islam!" and rode straight into the heart of the battle. Whether the details happened exactly as written or not, the effect was undeniable. His charge transformed the fight from a simple military engagement into a battle for the soul of a civilization. The Mamluks rallied with explosive determination. In the chaos that followed, Kitbuqa was surrounded and killed. His fall was more than symbolic. It was catastrophic for Mongol command. Their armies relied on strict coordination and a clear hierarchy. Without their general, communication shattered. There was no one left to order a retreat or regroup the units. The Mongol line collapsed. For the first time in living memory, a Mongol army wasn't just defeated, it was destroyed. Historians would later call Ain Jalut the first true, decisive defeat the Mongols ever suffered in open battle. For half a century, they had seemed like a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable. But in the narrow valley near a modest spring, that myth finally cracked. The Mamluks did what no one else had done. They met the Mongol storm head-on and survived. And here is the crucial truth about Ain Jalut. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't simply that the Mongols were distracted by events in China. Ain Jalut was the point where a temporary political pause turned into a permanent military boundary. One school of thought, the soft stop theory, claims that the Mongol advance ended only because Möngke Khan died, forcing Hulagu to withdraw. According to this logic, the Mongols didn't lose, they merely paused. But there's a glaring flaw in that argument. It assumes Kitbuqa could not have advanced further. Yet this was the same commander whose forces had obliterated Baghdad only 2 years earlier, a city defended by tens of thousands behind towering walls. If he had captured Cairo, even briefly, the Mongols could have consolidated Egypt and waited for reinforcements. The hard stop theory tells a far more convincing story. It argues that Ain Jalut was not an accident. It was a decisive, irreversible defeat. Historically, the Mongols had an iron rule. If someone beat them once, that someone had better run fast, because the Mongols always returned with overwhelming vengeance. They did so in Hungary in 1241, in Western Xia in 1227, in Khwarezm in 1221. But after Ain Jalut, nothing. They never returned for Cairo. Not once. That single fact reveals how deep the wound truly was. The victory at Ain Jalut didn't just halt an invasion, it redrew the map. The Mamluk Sultanate became a permanent barrier between the Mongols and the Mediterranean, a frontier they would never again cross. The psychological impact spread even further. For decades, the Mongols had ruled not only through military force, but through the myth of their invincibility. Cities surrendered at the mere sight of their banners. But Ain Jalut shattered that myth. The world learned the Mongols could be stopped and bled. The ripples only widened. The battle didn't merely halt Mongol expansion, it accelerated their fragmentation. The death of Möngke had already destabilized the empire politically. Ain Jalut added humiliation, fury, and religious divisions into the mix. It became the spark that ignited the first full-scale Mongol civil war between Möngke Khan of the Golden Horde and Hulagu of the Ilkhanate. Möngke, a Muslim convert, saw Hulagu's sack of Baghdad and his defeat at Ain Jalut as divine punishment. His armies attacked Hulagu in the Caucasus, forcing him to redirect men and supplies away from the Middle East forever. This shift was fatal for Mongol ambitions in the Levant. Their empire depended on constant expansion, each conquest supplying the momentum and wealth for the next. When the flow of plunder stopped, the machine faltered. The Ilkhanate soon faced shortages, internal disputes, and power struggles that hollowed it out from within. So while the Kurultai may have begun to slow down, Ain Jalut cemented it. It marked the point of no return, the moment a temporary pause became a permanent limit. The Mongols had conquered from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of the Mediterranean. But at Ain Jalut, for the first time, they struck a barrier they could not break. In the vast sweep of history, Ain Jalut stands as the turning point that shattered the Mongols' dream of a single empire spanning the known world. It preserved the Islamic world from collapse, ensured the survival of the Mamluk Sultanate, and indirectly shielded Europe from an invasion that might have come from the south. And in the hills of Galilee, quietly, without fanfare, the Mongol dream of global domination finally died.